On the outskirts of London, and not too far from the banks of the River Thames, is a stunning 17th century stately home. Ham House was built in 1610 by Sir Thomas Vavasour, a man who had a very important job. As a Knight Marshal, he was the man responsible for maintaining order in the court of King James I. The location of Ham House provided Sir Thomas with a place to retreat from his hectic job, but it also meant he wasn't too far away from the king if he was needed. The house originally had a H-plan layout with 9 bays, and it was 3 stories high. Sir Thomas allowed James I to give the house to his son, Henry, the Prince of Wales. The king gave the house to his son Charles after Prince Henry died in 1612. Upon Sir Thomas Vavasour's death in 1620, the first Earl of Holderness, John Ramsay, inherited the house. When he passed away, the lease was given to the first Earl of Dysart, William Murray. He had been the whipping boy and childhood friend of King Charles I. A whipping boy's sole purpose was to take the blame for another person's wrongdoing, as well as being punished. The lease allowed William and his family to live at Ham Hall for 39 years, and this was extended another 14 years in 1631. William and his wife Catherine spent time refurbishing and redecorating the house between 1637 and 1639. But trouble was brewing in England, and the Civil War was about to begin. Not long before the war started, William transferred the ownership of Ham House to his wife for as long as she lived. The house would then pass on to his 4 daughters. The house would be held in trust, with the principal trustee being Lord Elgin. The Murray family were royalists and supported the king, but as Lord Elgin was a supporter of Parliament, he was able to give the family some political protection as the English Civil War raged on. Charles I found himself without a head in 1649, and Catherine died that same year. With the king executed, parliamentarians decided to sell off much of the land Ham House stood on, as well as the house itself. It looked as though the Murray family had to say goodbye to Ham House. However, the following year, William Adams bought the house and land that were up for sale. He was acting on behalf of William and Catherine's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, and her husband, Lionel Ptolemaish, the 3rd Baronet of Helmingham Hall in Suffolk. Ham House became the main residence of Elizabeth and Lionel. Elizabeth and Lionel continued to support the royalist cause, even becoming members of the Sealed Knot. This was a secret royalist group, and its main aim was to restore the monarchy during the English interregnum. Elizabeth and Lionel wasted no time in creating a new generation of the Murray family. They had 11 children together, but only 5 of those children reached adulthood. The monarchy was restored in 1660, but 5 years later, William Murray, who had been exiled in France, died. Only 3 years later, in 1668, Lionel passed away. It would be 4 years before Elizabeth married again, this time to John Maitland, the 1st Duke of Lauderdale. There had been rumours of an affair between Elizabeth and John before Lionel died, and after the death of her first husband, Elizabeth set about making her mark on Ham House. She filled the house with furniture from all over the world and extended the house by filling in the southern section of the H layout. John died in 1682, and by this time the family was no longer favoured by the royals. Elizabeth had no choice but to sell off her possessions. By the time she died in 1698, ill health and gout, as well as old age, had confined Elizabeth to a small section of the house on the ground floor. Elizabeth had once been able to live a luxurious life at Ham House, but writings she made revealed how she felt towards the end of her life. Elizabeth wrote, "I am a prisoner now in my beloved Ham House, and I will never leave." Elizabeth's eldest son Lionel inherited the house upon her death. It was Lionel's son who made changes to the home, replacing the roof tiles with slates, installing Venetian and sash windows, and redecorating when the house needed it. But by the time the 8th Earl of Dysart, William Ptolemaish, died in the 1800s, the house was falling apart. Luck was on the side of Ham House, however, and by 1885 it had been restored. Just 2 years later, a garden party was hosted at the house in celebration of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. The start of the 1900s saw the introduction of electricity and central heating to the house. One bathroom even had a bath with jets and a wave machine. The 9th Earl of Dysart was known for travelling. He had also invested well in the stock market and supported the local community. His wife, however, left him when the 20th century was in its infancy because of his foul manner. The 9th Earl continued living at the estate, employing a staff of up to 20 people. He died in 1935, leaving investments worth nearly £5 million. However, he didn't have an heir, and he became the last Earl to live in Ham House. The 9th Earl's niece, Winifred, inherited the earldom, but it was her cousin, Sir Lionel, who moved into the house, aged 81, along with his middle-aged son. But it was difficult to maintain Ham House. There was a lack of staff due to World War II, and the house even suffered damage during the bombing raids, as a nearby aircraft factory was a target. The National Trust, a charity that aims to preserve the nation's heritage and countryside, was first invited to view the house in 1943. In 1949, the stables, outlying buildings, and much of the estate were sold. By now, the National Trust had acquired the house itself, but it transferred ownership of the building to the Ministry of Works, a governmental department in World War II, which organised the requisitioning of property for wartime use. The house opened to the public in 1950, but it would take the government until 1990 to return the lease to the National Trust. Ham House is not without its ghost stories. The 9th Earl of Dysart has been seen in the grounds. Back in the first half of the 20th century, the Earl's chauffeur, Mr. Allen, and his family lived in a cottage by the gate. But despite the fact that the Earl seemed to be in a permanent bad mood, Christmas time seemed to warm his cold heart. Every Christmas Eve, the Earl, armed with presents, would make the journey across the grounds to Mr. Allen's home, where he would spend time with the Allens before returning home. The Earl is still making this journey after his death. He was partially blind and used a stick to help guide him to the cottage. To this day, the tapping of the stick and knocking on the cottage door can still be heard. A servant named John or James McFarlane has been seen on the terrace on cold nights, centuries after his death. In 1790, he committed suicide by throwing himself from a window. McFarlane had fallen in love with a kitchen maid, but he chose to end his life after learning that his love was unrequited. Just before he jumped, he scratched his name on a window pane with a diamond ring. His screams can still be heard, and a woman seen weeping in the garden is said to be the ghost of the kitchen maid who was unable to return McFarlane's feelings. Visitors to the house and grounds have reported seeing a woman waving at them from an upstairs window. She is Charlotte Walpole, once the Countess of Dysart, and seems to be quite happy that visitors are enjoying the home she once lived in. A King Charles Cocker Spaniel has been seen running around the gardens to the delight of visitors. The little dog has also been seen running inside the house on the parquet floors, as well as on the upper floors. One visitor complained to the staff that she hadn't been allowed to bring her dog inside Ham House, even though she had seen one running around as she toured the house. She likely looked confused when she was told that there aren't any dogs in the house. Around 2010, the skeleton of a dog was uncovered in the kitchen garden. Loud noises have been heard coming from the servants' quarters, and an antique wheelchair kept in that particular part of the house has been known to move on its own. On one occasion, a house steward watched as a clergyman dressed in black robes crossed a barrier rope. Knowing that the man had entered a part of the house he wasn't supposed to be in, the house steward followed him, only to watch in shock as the clergyman disappeared through a closed servant's door. The clergyman may be Gilbert Spinks, who was the chaplain of the Duke of Lauderdale. Gilbert Spinks would often use the servants' passages to access the Duke's rooms. In 1992, the chapel at Ham House was restored. After workmen finished for the day, the chapel would be locked. However, on one particular morning, the workmen opened up the chapel and found a handprint and marks of a skirt in the plaster dust on one of the pews. This pew once belonged to Elizabeth Murray, and it's her ghost that staff say causes an oppressive atmosphere whenever she roams the house. Elizabeth has been seen kneeling by the altar in the chapel, where the first Duke of Lauderdale was laid out for a week after his death. But she doesn't just confine herself to the chapel. The smell of Elizabeth's rose perfume lingers throughout the house, and the sounds of her silk dress moving have been heard. Elizabeth walks the corridors in the evening and late at night, especially when the house is quiet. Elizabeth has been seen on the staircase dressed in black, and, it is said, she walked with a cane in old age, which can be heard tapping in the corridors at night. Once, a National Trust employee was working in the office. he had the building all to himself. Everything was going as he expected it to, until he began to hear the sounds of someone pacing up and down the corridor outside the office. The incident frightened the man so much that he refused to leave the office. Is Elizabeth keeping an eye on the charity that now runs the home that eventually became her prison in life? One sighting of Elizabeth dates back to 1879 and was recorded by Augustus Hare in his book The Story of My Life, published in 1900. The account reads as follows. There is a ghost at Ham. The old butler there had a little girl. She was then 6 years old. In the small hours of the morning, when dawn was making things clear, the child, waking up, saw a little old woman scratching with her finger against the wall close to the fireplace. She was not at all frightened at first, but sat up to look at her. The noise she made in doing this caused the old woman to look round, and she came to the foot of the bed, and, grasping the rail, stared at the child long and fixedly. So horrible was her stare that the child was terrified and screamed and hid her face. People ran in, and the child told what she had seen. The wall was examined where she had seen the figure scratching, and concealed in it were papers, which proved that in that room Elizabeth had murdered her first husband to marry the Duke of Lauderdale. In the ground floor rooms that Elizabeth was confined to in her later years, footprints appear on the floor that lead to the fireplace. Staff greet Elizabeth when they enter that part of the house, perhaps thinking that ignoring her presence will only cause Elizabeth to seek them out. Pets that live in the employees' quarters are reluctant to enter Elizabeth's rooms. 2 cats that used to live on site would often hiss at Elizabeth's portrait. It seems that Elizabeth is watching over the house she once loved so much. Ham House is a beautiful property with a rich and haunted history. It seems that visitors to the home are just as likely to encounter happy spirits as they are negative ones. If you ever visit Ham House, make sure you don't glance into a silver and ebony looking glass that Elizabeth once owned. You don't want to be added to the list of people who have looked into the mirror and seen Elizabeth looming behind them. Happy nightmares.